They say a mother's love is unconditional. They never warn you that sometimes your child's love comes with conditions you'll never be able to meet. My name is Elena, and I'm 58 years old. For 35 years, I was a school teacher. I shaped young minds, wiped away tears, and celebrated every small victory with children who weren't even mine. I believed in second chances, in the power of patience, and in the beauty of watching someone grow. I thought those same principles would guide my relationship with my own daughter forever. When my husband Robert passed away last winter, the grief felt like drowning in an endless ocean. We had been married for 32 years. He was my anchor, my safe harbor, the one person who truly understood the woman behind the teacher's smile. The morning he didn't wake up beside me, I felt like half of my soul had been torn away, leaving me incomplete and gasping for air in a world that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. The funeral was a blur of flowers, condolences, and well-meaning neighbors who promised to check on me. But when the last guest left and the casseroles ran out, I found myself alone in a house that echoed with memories I wasn't ready to face. Every corner held traces of Robert, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug still in the sink, his favorite sweater draped over the chair where he used to sit and grade my students' papers with me. Laura, my only child, seemed genuinely concerned during those first few weeks. She called daily, brought groceries, and even stayed overnight a few times when the loneliness felt unbearable. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone right now," she said, with what I thought was genuine warmth. "Why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you feel stronger?" The invitation felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Laura had a beautiful home in the suburbs, a 2-story house with a garden I had helped her plant when she first moved in 5 years ago. She lived there with her husband Mark and their teenage son Danny. It seemed perfect, a place where I could heal surrounded by family, where I could be useful again instead of just surviving each day. I remember packing my suitcase with such hope. I folded my clothes carefully, including the blue dress Robert always said brought out my eyes. I packed my favorite books, a few cherished photographs, and the small sewing kit that had belonged to my mother. Everything I needed to start over, to rebuild myself in the warmth of my daughter's home. The first week was everything I had hoped for. Laura made my favorite soup. We watched old movies together, and I helped Danny with his history homework. For brief, precious moments, I felt like myself again, not just the broken widow, but Elena the mother, Elena the grandmother, Elena the woman who still had something valuable to offer. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small things that I told myself didn't matter. Laura would forget to set a place for me at dinner, then act surprised when I appeared in the dining room. "Oh, Mom, I didn't know you were eating with us tonight," she'd say, rushing to grab another plate. Her tone was polite but distant, as if I were an unexpected guest, rather than her mother. The conversations that had flowed so naturally during those first days began to feel forced and brief. When I tried to share stories about my students or memories of her father, Laura would glance at her phone or suddenly remember something urgent she needed to do. "That's nice, Mom," became her standard response, delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I found myself spending more time in the guest room, reading or working on small sewing projects to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. The blue walls that had once seemed cheerful now felt like the boundaries of a gilded cage. I could hear the family downstairs, their voices mixing with the sound of the television, their laughter floating up through the floorboards like music from a party I wasn't invited to attend. One evening, I gathered the courage to bring up something that had been troubling me. "Laura, honey," I said as she rushed past me in the hallway, "I was wondering if we could talk. I feel like I'm in the way here, and I don't want to be a burden. Maybe we could discuss how I can contribute more to the household." She stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. When she finally faced me, her expression was carefully neutral. "Mom, you're not a burden," she said, but the words felt rehearsed, empty of the conviction I desperately needed to hear. "You're welcome here as long as you need to be, as long as I need to be." The phrase echoed in my mind long after she continued down the hallway. It implied temporary status, a conditional welcome that could be revoked when my need was no longer deemed valid or convenient. I started noticing other things. How conversations would stop when I entered a room, how family decisions were made without consulting me, even about things that affected my daily routine. How my presence at dinner seemed to create an awkward silence that everyone worked too hard to fill with forced cheerfulness. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was sitting in the living room, trying to mend a tear in one of Danny's school shirts. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the task required concentration and patience. Qualities I had cultivated over decades of teaching, but that felt fragile now, like everything else in my life. The afternoon light streaming through the windows was perfect for detailed work, and for a few moments I felt genuinely useful. This was something I could do well, something that mattered. I was helping my family in a small but meaningful way, proving that I still had value beyond just taking up space and eating food. Laura came into the room while I was working, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. I looked up, ready to show her my progress, perhaps to share a small moment of pride in a job well done. Instead, I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before, not irritation or impatience, but something colder, more final. If you enjoy emotional stories like this, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. Before I could speak, before I could ask what was wrong or try to bridge whatever gap had opened between us, Laura stepped forward and did something that shattered not just my heart, but my entire understanding of who I thought my daughter was. She shoved me, not gently, not accidentally, but with deliberate force that sent me backward in my chair. The sewing scattered across the floor, the shirt I had been mending torn worse than before. "This isn't your home anymore," she said, her voice cold and sharp as winter wind. In that moment, sitting there surrounded by scattered thread and broken promises, I realized that the daughter I had raised, the child I had sacrificed for, the young woman I had believed in even when she made mistakes, that person had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who could look at her grieving mother and see only an inconvenience to be removed. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with 30 years of bedtime stories, school plays, graduation celebrations, and late-night conversations about dreams and fears. All of it reduced to this moment, this rejection, this casual cruelty that would echo in my heart forever. Something inside me cracked, but it wasn't just my heart breaking. It was the sound of illusions shattering, of comfortable lies finally giving way to painful truth. I was alone in a way I had never been before. The hours after Laura shoved me felt like living in a nightmare where everything familiar had been twisted into something unrecognizable. I sat on the floor of that living room for what felt like an eternity, gathering scattered thread and trying to piece together not just the torn fabric, but my understanding of the woman who had once been my little girl. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what had happened. Maybe she was stressed about work. Maybe Mark was pressuring her about something. Maybe having me in the house was causing problems in her marriage that I hadn't noticed. I was desperately grasping for any reason that would transform her cruelty into something I could forgive, something I could fix. But when I finally stood up and looked into her eyes, I saw no regret, no shock at what she had done. There was only cold calculation, as if she had been planning this moment for weeks and was relieved to finally let the mask slip. "I think it's time you made other arrangements," she continued, her voice steady and businesslike, as if she were discussing the weather rather than abandoning her mother. "Mark and I have been talking, and we feel like you've had enough time to process Dad's death. You need to start building your own life again." Mark appeared in the doorway as if he had been waiting for his cue. My son-in-law, who had eaten countless dinners at my table, who had called me Mom for the past 12 years, who had hugged me at Robert's funeral and promised I would never be alone. Now he stood there with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement with his wife's heartless ultimatum. "It's really for the best, Elena," he said, not even having the courtesy to meet my eyes. "You're a strong woman. You don't need to depend on us forever." The word depend hit me like another physical blow. Is that what they thought this was? That I was some kind of parasite, feeding off their generosity instead of a grieving widow who had lost her partner of 32 years? I had been paying for my own food, helping with household chores, contributing to utility bills with what little remained of Robert's life insurance money. I had been trying so hard not to be a burden that I had apparently made myself invisible. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It was a practical question, but it carried the weight of a deeper truth. I had nowhere in the world that felt like home anymore. Laura shrugged, a gesture so casual it felt like a slap. There are senior communities, assisted living places. You could rent a small apartment. You taught school for 35 years. Surely you have some savings, some pension plan. She was right, of course. I did have a small pension, and Robert had left me with enough to survive modestly if I was careful. But she was missing the point entirely. This wasn't about money or logistics. This was about family, about love, about the promise that we would take care of each other no matter what life threw at us. I don't need assisted living, I said, trying to keep my dignity intact even as I felt myself crumbling. I just needed time. I needed my family while I learned how to live without him. Well, you've had 3 months, Laura replied with the efficiency of someone checking items off a to-do list. That should be enough time to figure things out. 3 months. She was measuring my grief in calendar pages, as if healing from the loss of a life partner followed some predetermined schedule that she had researched online. As if the woman who had once cried in my arms over a broken toy or a failed test could now calculate exactly how long her mother was allowed to mourn before becoming an inconvenience. Danny, my grandson, appeared at the top of the stairs. He was 16, tall and awkward in the way that teenage boys often are, but his eyes held a wisdom that his parents seemed to have lost. He looked confused, as if he had heard raised voices but couldn't understand why his grandmother was sitting on the floor looking devastated. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Grandma Elena is going to find her own place," Laura said brightly, her tone completely different from the coldness she had directed at me. "She's ready to start the next chapter of her life." I wanted to scream at the lie, to tell Danny the truth about what had just happened, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy his image of his mother, even if she had just destroyed mine. Some wounds are too deep to heal, but some truths are too heavy for young hearts to carry. "But why?" Danny asked, looking between his mother and me with growing concern. "I thought she was staying with us." "It's complicated, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone adults use when they want to end uncomfortable conversations. "Sometimes grown-ups need their own space." I could see Danny processing this explanation, trying to reconcile it with what he was observing. He was smart enough to sense the tension in the room, mature enough to recognize that something was very wrong with this picture. But he was also 16 and dependent on his parents for everything, which meant questioning their actions required a courage that few teenagers possess. "I understand," I said quietly, more to spare Danny than to agree with Laura's decision. "I'll pack my things tonight." The relief on Laura's face was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than anything else that had happened. She had been waiting for me to make this easy for her, to spare her the guilt of actually throwing me out by agreeing to leave voluntarily. She wanted my cooperation in my own abandonment. That evening, I packed my suitcase for the second time in 3 months, but this time there was no hope mixed in with my belongings. I folded the same blue dress that Robert had loved, but now it felt like a costume for a play I was no longer performing in. The photographs went back into my bag, along with my books and my mother's sewing kit, but they felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that they were all I had left. As I closed the suitcase, I could hear the family downstairs carrying on with their evening routine as if nothing had changed. The television was on, Danny was probably doing homework, Laura was likely preparing for tomorrow's work presentations. Life was continuing normally for them, while mine had just been uprooted again. I sat on the edge of the bed where I had spent the last 3 months trying to heal, and I let myself cry for the first time since Robert's funeral. But these tears were different. They weren't just for grief anymore. They were for betrayal, for the loss of innocence, for the realization that the daughter I had raised with love and sacrifice had grown into someone capable of casual cruelty toward the person who had given her everything. The worst part wasn't the physical shove or even the cruel words. The worst part was the efficiency of it all, the way she had reduced 30 years of my devotion to a problem that needed to be solved. I wasn't her mother in that moment. I was just an obstacle to whatever life she had planned, an inconvenience to be managed and removed. I thought about all the times I had stayed up all night when she was sick, the way I had worked extra jobs to pay for her college tuition, the dreams I had deferred so she could chase hers. I remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle, helping her with math homework, celebrating every milestone and comforting her through every heartbreak. Where was that little girl now? When had she been replaced by this stranger who could look at her broken mother and feel only irritation? The house settled around me as the family went to sleep, and I realized this would be my last night under this roof. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out how to rebuild a life that had already been shattered once. I would have to find somewhere to live, some way to fill the endless days ahead, some reason to keep going when the people I loved most had made it clear that my love was no longer wanted or needed. But as I lay there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. The initial shock was wearing off, and beneath the pain I felt something else stirring, a quiet anger that I had never allowed myself to feel before. Not rage or bitterness, but a clean, clear recognition of injustice that demanded acknowledgement. I had spent my entire adult life putting others first, and where had it gotten me? Alone, unwanted, treated like garbage by the child I had sacrificed everything to raise. Maybe it was time to stop being the accommodating mother, the convenient widow, the woman who disappeared whenever her presence became inconvenient for others. Maybe it was time to remember who Elena used to be before she became everyone else's caretaker. The next morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through decades of memories, trying to pinpoint when I had stopped being Laura's mother and started being her problem. I kept searching for signs I had missed, conversations I had misunderstood, moments when I should have seen this coming. I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the one Robert always said made me look dignified, and came downstairs with my packed suitcase. I told myself I would leave with grace, that I wouldn't give Laura the satisfaction of seeing me beg or break down. But part of me still hoped that seeing me ready to go would shock her back to her senses, would remind her that I was her mother, not some unwanted house guest. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, the familiar sounds of a family starting their day. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Danny was eating cereal while scrolling through his phone. Mark was reading news on his tablet, and Laura was packing lunches with the efficient movements of a woman who had her routine perfected. "Good morning," I said quietly, setting my suitcase by the back door. Laura glanced up from the sandwich she was making, her expression neutral. "Morning, Mom. I called a cab for you. It should be here in about 20 minutes. A cab. Not even the courtesy of a ride from her own family. I was being dismissed like a service that was no longer needed, sent away in the back of a stranger's car while the people I loved most went about their daily lives without missing a beat. Where? I started to ask where I was supposed to go, but the words stuck in my throat. The question felt too pathetic, too desperate. I was 58 years old, and I should have been able to answer that for myself. I found some information about extended stay hotels, Laura continued, pulling a piece of paper from her purse. There's one about 15 minutes from here that offers weekly rates. It should give you time to find something permanent. She handed me the paper like she was doing me a favor, as if researching budget accommodations for her displaced mother was an act of kindness rather than the bare minimum of human decency. The hotel she had chosen was the kind of place people stayed when they had nowhere else to go, a step above homelessness, but not by much. Danny looked up from his cereal, his young face creased with confusion. "Grandma, are you really leaving today?" Before I could answer, Laura stepped in with her practiced efficiency. "Grandma needs her independence, honey. She's going to find a nice little place of her own where she can have her privacy and do things her way." The lies came so easily to her, wrapped in language that made my abandonment sound like my choice, my liberation rather than my exile. She had turned my devastation into my empowerment, my rejection into my freedom. "But what about Sunday dinners?" Danny asked, his voice carrying the innocence of someone who still believed family bonds couldn't be severed by convenience. "And who's going to help me with history? You're the best at explaining the wars." My heart clenched at his words. Those Sunday dinners had become precious to me, the one day of the week when I felt truly included in their family life. And our history sessions, Danny struggling with dates and battles while I helped him understand the human stories behind the conflicts, had become some of my favorite moments in this house. "You'll figure out the history on your own," Mark said, not looking up from his tablet. "You're smart enough, and Mom can always visit for dinner sometime." Sometime. The word hung in the air like a broken promise, vague and non-committal, the kind of offer that sounds generous but means nothing. I knew, even if Danny didn't, that sometime in this context meant never. I wanted to tell Danny how much our conversations had meant to me, how proud I was of his curiosity and intelligence, how much I would miss watching him grow up. But Laura was watching me with the sharp attention of someone monitoring a potential disruption, and I couldn't bear to create a scene that would only make things harder for my grandson. "You can call me anytime you need help with anything," I said instead, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll always be here for you." Laura's jaw tightened slightly at my words, as if even that simple promise was an overreach, an unwelcome reminder that severing family ties wasn't as clean and simple as she wanted it to be. The cab arrived exactly on schedule, its yellow bulk visible through the kitchen window like a rescue vehicle that had come to the wrong emergency. The driver honked once, a sharp sound that cut through the morning stillness and announced that my time in this house had officially expired. "That's your ride," Laura said, her tone bright and false, as if she were announcing good news instead of my deportation. I picked up my suitcase, surprised by how light it felt. 3 months of living here, and everything I owned still fit in one bag. Had I always lived so lightly? Or had I simply learned not to accumulate things because some part of me always expected to be moved along? As I walked toward the door, I passed the refrigerator covered with Danny's school achievements, family photos, and the magnetic poetry words he liked to rearrange into silly sentences. There, almost hidden behind a grocery list, was a picture from last Christmas. Me, Robert, Laura, Mark, and Danny all gathered around the tree in our living room. We looked happy. We looked like a family. I had given Laura that photo just 4 months ago, back when I still believed our bond was unbreakable. Now it felt like evidence from a crime scene, proof of something beautiful that had been destroyed. "Goodbye," I said to the room in general, not trusting myself to look directly at anyone. Danny jumped up from his chair and gave me a quick, awkward hug. The kind teenagers give when they're not sure what else to do, but know they should do something. His arms were thin but strong, and for a moment, I felt like someone's grandmother again, instead of just an unwanted burden. "I'll miss you, Grandma," he whispered against my shoulder. "I'll miss you too, sweetheart," I managed to say, before my voice broke completely. Laura and Mark offered perfunctory goodbyes, their voices polite but distant, as if they were seeing off an acquaintance rather than a family member. No hugs, no tears, no acknowledgement that something irreparable was happening in that kitchen. The cab driver was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who helped me with my suitcase without asking questions. As we pulled away from the house, I looked back to see Laura already closing the door, eager to return to her normal routine, now that the unpleasant task of disposing of her mother had been completed. The extended stay hotel was exactly what I had expected. A sterile building designed for people in transition, people who had nowhere else to go. My room was small and impersonal, with a kitchenette that consisted of a microwave, a mini refrigerator, and a hot plate. The bed was hard, the carpet was stained, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear other people's conversations, arguments, and late-night television shows. But it was mine. For the first time in 3 months, I had privacy, space where I could cry without worrying about disturbing anyone or being judged for taking too long to heal. I could eat when I was hungry, instead of when meals were scheduled, sleep when I was tired instead of when the household went quiet. The loneliness was crushing, but it was a clean loneliness, honest in its emptiness rather than disguised as family togetherness. I spent the first few days in a haze of disbelief and pain, alternating between sleep and staring out the window at the parking lot below. Other residents came and went, mostly men who looked like they were between jobs, a few women who seemed to be escaping from situations they didn't want to discuss, elderly people whose families had probably made calculations similar to Laura's. I wasn't unique here. I was just another person who had discovered that the safety nets they thought were permanent could disappear without warning, leaving them to figure out how to rebuild their lives from whatever pieces remained. On the 4th day, I forced myself to go to the grocery store. Walking through those familiar aisles, I was reminded of all the shopping trips I had taken for Laura's family, carefully planning meals and stretching the budget to make sure there was always enough for everyone. Now I was shopping for one, buying single portions of everything, learning to think in terms of just myself after decades of considering others first. An elderly woman in the cereal aisle smiled at me, and for a moment I felt visible again, acknowledged as someone worth greeting. We chatted briefly about the weather, about the high cost of groceries, about the small challenges of daily life. It was such a simple interaction, but it reminded me that the world contained kindness, even if my own family had forgotten how to show it. That evening, alone in my hotel room with my modest groceries put away, I called the one person I thought might understand what I was going through, my sister Ruth, who lived 3 states away and hadn't spoken to her own daughter in 2 years after a similar family explosion. "Elena?" Ruth's voice was surprised but warm. "I was wondering when you'd call. You knew this would happen?" I asked. "I hoped it wouldn't," she said sadly. "But I saw the signs at Robert's funeral, the way Laura kept checking her watch, the way she talked about your recovery timeline like grief was a project to be managed. Some children grow up to see their parents as investments that should pay dividends, and when the returns disappoint them, they cut their losses." Her words were brutal but accurate, and hearing them from someone who understood made me feel less crazy, less like I had somehow imagined or deserved the cruelty I had experienced. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You remember who you were before you became everyone's mother," Ruth said without hesitation. "You remember that Elena who taught children, who made a difference in hundreds of young lives, who had dreams and talents that existed independently of your family role. That woman is still in there, and she deserves better than this." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my hotel room and tried to remember who Elena had been before marriage and motherhood consumed her identity. I thought about the young teacher who had been excited about shaping minds and changing lives, the woman who had believed education could transform the world one student at a time. Where had that passion gone? When had I stopped believing in my own value beyond what I could provide for others? Maybe it was time to find out. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors left in the rain. I had been living in that extended stay hotel for almost a month, and what had started as temporary refuge was beginning to feel like a permanent prison of my own circumstances. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of other people's lives beginning, car doors slamming, children laughing on their way to school, the distant hum of a world that was moving forward while I remained suspended in place. I had nowhere urgent to be, no one depending on me, no routine that gave structure to the endless hours between sunrise and sunset. I started taking long walks around the neighborhood, partly for exercise but mostly to feel like I was going somewhere, even if I had no destination. The area around the hotel was a mix of strip malls, chain restaurants, and residential streets lined with modest houses where normal families lived normal lives. I would walk past these homes during dinner time, catching glimpses through lit windows of people gathered around tables, sharing meals and conversations that I was no longer part of anywhere. One evening, I found myself standing outside a house where a family was having what looked like a birthday party. Through the window, I could see a little girl in a pink dress blowing out candles while adults applauded and took pictures. The grandmother, a woman about my age, was sitting at the head of the table, beaming with pride as she helped the child make a wish. I stood there for longer than I should have, watching this scene of ordinary family joy, remembering when I had been the grandmother at the center of such celebrations. Danny's 13th birthday party, where I had spent the morning making his favorite chocolate cake from scratch. Laura's wedding, where I had cried happy tears while helping her get ready. Christmas mornings when Robert was still alive, and we would all gather in our living room to exchange gifts and share stories. When had I become the person on the outside looking in? When had I been demoted from participating in life to simply observing it from a distance? I turned away from the window before anyone inside could notice me lurking, but the image stayed with me as I walked back to my temporary home. That grandmother had what I had lost. Not just a place at the table, but the certainty that she belonged there, that her presence was wanted and valued. The phone calls I had been hoping for never came. I checked my messages obsessively, thinking surely Laura would realize her mistake and reach out to apologize, or at least to see how I was managing on my own. Even a brief text asking if I was okay would have felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. But my phone remained stubbornly silent. And with each passing day, that silence spoke louder than words ever could. I wasn't missed. My absence from their daily routine hadn't created the void I had imagined it would. Life was continuing smoothly without me, which meant I had been even less essential than I had feared. I tried calling Danny once, desperate to hear a familiar voice that might still carry some warmth for me. He answered on the third ring, sounding happy to hear from me, and for a few precious minutes I felt connected to something real again. "How's school going?" I asked, clinging to this normal conversation like a lifeline. "Pretty good. I got an A on that history test you helped me study for," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I knew you could do it." We talked for maybe 10 minutes about his classes, his friends, a movie he wanted to see. But then I heard Laura's voice in the background, sharp and questioning. "Danny, who are you talking to?" There was a pause, and when Danny came back on the line, his voice had changed. "I should probably go, Grandma. I have homework to finish." The excuse was polite but transparent. Laura had ended our conversation as efficiently as she had ended my residency in their home, and Danny, caught between loyalties, had chosen the path that would cause him the least trouble. After he hung up, I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and stared at the phone in my hand. Even this small connection to my grandson was being monitored and controlled. Another reminder that I was no longer considered family, but rather a disruptive influence to be managed and contained. I had been reduced to the status of a distant relative who might upset the household balance, someone whose love was inconvenient and whose presence was unwelcome. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself, it was the efficiency of it. Laura hadn't struggled with her decision to cast me out. She hadn't lost sleep over my feelings or worried about the impact on Danny or questioned whether she was making the right choice. My removal from their lives had been as smooth and emotionless as rearranging furniture to improve the flow of a room. 30 years of bedtime stories, school conferences, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, scraped knee kisses, homework help, and unconditional love had been weighed against their convenience and found lacking. I started having conversations with Robert's memory during those long, lonely evenings. Speaking aloud to the empty room felt less crazy than keeping all my thoughts trapped inside my head, and somehow it felt like he was still listening, still caring about what happened to the woman he had loved for 32 years. "I don't know what to do," I would whisper into the darkness. "I don't know how to matter to anyone anymore." I imagined his voice responding with the gentle wisdom he had always offered when I faced difficult situations. He would remind me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it, that I had spent decades making a difference in the lives of students who might not even remember my name, but carried lessons I had taught them. But even Robert's imagined comfort couldn't fill the vast emptiness that had opened up in my chest. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, visible enough to take up space but not substantial enough to impact anyone else's existence. The hotel staff started recognizing me, greeting me with the careful friendliness reserved for long-term residents who might be struggling with more than just temporary housing needs. Maria, the young woman who cleaned my room, began leaving small touches that went beyond her job requirements. Fresh flowers from the hotel's landscaping, an extra towel folded into a decorative shape, a piece of chocolate left on my pillow. These tiny gestures of kindness from a stranger were both comforting and heartbreaking. A hotel housekeeper who barely knew me was showing more consideration for my well-being than my own daughter had demonstrated in our final weeks together. One particularly dark evening, when the loneliness felt like it was suffocating me, I found myself walking to a nearby church. I wasn't particularly religious, but the building was lit from within, and through the windows I could see people gathering for what looked like a support group meeting. I stood outside for a long time, watching people enter and leave, wondering if they would welcome a woman who was grieving not just the loss of her husband, but the death of every relationship she had thought was permanent. What would I say if someone asked why I was there? That my own daughter had discarded me like an unwanted piece of furniture? That I was 58 years old and had nowhere in the world where I truly belonged? In the end, I walked away without going inside. I wasn't ready to admit out loud how completely my life had fallen apart. Wasn't prepared to hear my story reflected in other people's faces as they recognized their own pain in my circumstances. But as I walked back to the hotel that night, something small but significant had shifted inside me. For the first time since Robert's death, I had felt drawn to something beyond my own suffering. The church had represented possibility, community, connection, things I had given up hoping for. Maybe I wasn't as completely broken as I had believed. Maybe somewhere beneath all the grief and rejection and loneliness, there was still a spark of the woman I used to be, the one who had believed she had something valuable to offer the world. That night, as I lay in the uncomfortable hotel bed, listening to the sounds of other people's temporary lives through the thin walls, I made myself a promise that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would not disappear quietly. I would not let Laura's rejection define the rest of my story. I had been Elena Morrison the teacher, Elena Morrison the wife, Elena Morrison the mother. Now I needed to discover who Elena Morrison could be when she belonged only to herself. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something that couldn't be taken away with harsh words or closed doors. The change didn't come like lightning. It came like dawn. So gradual, I almost didn't notice it was happening. It started 3 days after my desperate walk past the church, when I was sitting in the hotel's small lobby, pretending to read a magazine while actually listening to other people's phone conversations, because they reminded me that human connection still existed somewhere in the world. An elderly man was talking to his son, discussing plans for a visit. A middle-aged woman was coordinating care for her aging mother. Normal family conversations filled with the kind of casual affection I had taken for granted until it was gone. I was absorbing these ordinary exchanges like a person dying of thirst might savor drops of water, when something unexpected happened. A young woman approached my chair, her movement hesitant but determined. She was maybe 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was building courage for something difficult. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Are you Elena Morrison? Mrs. Morrison from Jefferson Elementary?" I looked up, startled to hear my name spoken by a stranger, especially connected to my teaching career from what felt like another lifetime ago. The young woman had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have known her. "Yes," I said slowly, my voice rusty from disuse. "I am, or I was." Her face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that transformed her entire expression from nervous uncertainty to radiant warmth. "I'm Sarah Chen. I was in your 4th grade class 15 years ago. I don't know if you remember me. I was really shy. Had trouble reading out loud." Sarah Chen. The name connected with a face from my memory. A small, quiet girl who used to sit in the 3rd row and duck her head whenever I called on students to read passages from our literature books. She had been bright but painfully self-conscious, the kind of child who needed extra encouragement to believe in her own abilities. "Sarah," I said, and suddenly I could see the little girl in this confident young woman's features. "Of course I remember you. You wrote the most beautiful story about a lost kitten finding its way home. We entered it in the district writing contest." The smile on her face grew even brighter. "You remember that? I can't believe you remember that story. I remember because you were so surprised when I told you how talented you were. You didn't believe me at first." Sarah laughed, a sound that carried 15 years of growth and confidence that had bloomed from the seeds of encouragement planted in my classroom. "I didn't believe you because I thought I was stupid. I had convinced myself that I couldn't do anything right, especially writing. But you kept working with me, staying after school to help me organize my thoughts and find the right words. I had forgotten about those after-school sessions, but now they came flooding back." Sarah struggling with sentence structure while I sat beside her, offering gentle guidance and endless patience. The way her confidence had gradually built as she realized she had stories worth telling and the ability to tell them well. "You changed my life," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I ended up majoring in journalism in college because you taught me that words have power, that stories matter, that even quiet people have important things to say. I'm a reporter now for the city newspaper. A reporter." This shy little girl who had been afraid to read aloud had grown up to make her living with words, to tell stories that informed and influenced others. I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that I hadn't experienced in months, the deep satisfaction of knowing that something I had done had mattered, had made a lasting difference in someone's life. "Sarah, that's wonderful," I said, and meant it completely. I'm so proud of you. I've been looking for you, she admitted. I heard you had retired, but I wanted to thank you properly for what you did for me. When I saw you sitting here, I almost couldn't believe it was really you. We talked for over an hour, sitting in that modest hotel lobby while Sarah told me about her career, her recent engagement, her plans to start a family someday. But more importantly, she told me about other students from my classes, children I had taught who had gone on to become doctors, teachers, social workers, artists, parents raising the next generation with kindness and wisdom. Each story was like a gift I didn't know I had been waiting to receive. For months, I had been measuring my worth by the rejection of one person who had forgotten my value. But here was evidence that my life had mattered to dozens of people, that seeds I had planted decades ago had grown into beautiful, productive lives. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah said as our conversation began to wind down, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are you doing in a hotel? Are you traveling? I hesitated, ashamed to admit the truth about my circumstances to this accomplished young woman who remembered me as someone strong and capable, but something in her genuine concern made honesty feel safer than pretense. I'm going through a difficult transition, I said carefully. My husband passed away recently and I'm figuring out what comes next. Sarah's expression immediately softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry for your loss. That must be incredibly difficult. It has been, I admitted. I feel a bit lost, to be honest. Like I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore. You're the teacher who changed my life, Sarah said without hesitation. You're the person who saw potential in a scared little girl and refused to let her give up on herself. You're someone who made the world better just by believing in people when they couldn't believe in themselves. Her words hit me like a revelation. I had been so focused on the roles I had lost, wife, mother, family member, that I had forgotten about the role that had defined me longest and most meaningfully. I had been a teacher, a shaper of young minds, a believer in human potential. Those weren't titles that could be stripped away by death or rejection. They were part of who I was at my core. Sarah, I said slowly as an idea began to form in my mind, do you know if there are any schools in the area that might need substitute teachers or tutors? Part-time positions for someone with experience? Her eyes lit up with understanding. Actually, yes. The school district where I live is always looking for qualified substitute teachers, especially ones with your level of experience. And I know there's a community center that runs after-school tutoring programs for kids who need extra help. She pulled out her phone and started making notes, giving me contact information, names of people to call, practical steps I could take to reconnect with the work that had once given my life purpose and meaning. But Mrs. Morrison, she added, looking up from her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read, can I ask you something? Have you ever thought about teaching abroad? There are programs that place experienced American teachers in international schools, especially in countries where English education is in high demand. Teaching abroad. The suggestion was so unexpected that I almost dismissed it immediately. I was 58 years old, recently widowed, essentially homeless. Who was I to think about starting over in a foreign country? But as Sarah continued talking, describing programs she had written about in her journalism work, something inside me began to stir. She told me about schools in Eastern Europe, South America, and Asia that desperately needed experienced teachers, places where American educators were not just welcomed, but celebrated for their expertise. The pay isn't always great, she admitted, but many positions include housing and the experience. Mrs. Morrison, imagine being able to use everything you've learned to help children in places where educational opportunities are limited. Imagine being seen as the treasure you are instead of... She trailed off, seeming to realize she was approaching sensitive territory. Instead of being treated like a burden, I finished for her, and she nodded with embarrassed understanding. After Sarah left, pressing her business card into my hand and making me promise to stay in touch, I sat alone in the lobby with my mind racing. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt something other than grief and desperation. I felt curiosity. I felt possibility. That evening, I used the hotel's computer to research the international teaching programs Sarah had mentioned. I read about schools in countries I had only seen in photographs, places where experienced teachers were desperately needed and genuinely valued. I looked at testimonials from retired American educators who had found new purpose and adventure in their later years. People who had discovered that endings could also be beginnings. I wasn't just reading about job opportunities. I was reading about transformation, about people who had reinvented themselves when life demanded it, who had found strength they didn't know they possessed. It wasn't pain anymore that I was feeling. It was something I had almost forgotten existed. It was decision. The woman who had been discarded, dismissed, and deemed worthless was beginning to remember something important about herself. I had spent 35 years believing in other people's potential. Maybe it was time to believe in my own. I pulled out a piece of hotel stationery and began making a list of the steps I would need to take. Updating my teaching credentials, researching visa requirements, preparing application materials. For the first time in months, I was planning for a future instead of just surviving each day. Somewhere across town, Laura was probably helping Danny with homework or planning tomorrow's family dinner. She had moved on with her life without giving me another thought, secure in her decision to remove the inconvenient presence of her mother. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had forgotten that before I was her mother, before I was Robert's wife, before I was anyone's caretaker, I had been Elena Morrison, teacher. And teachers, real teachers, never stop believing in the power of starting over. The application process took 3 weeks of meticulous preparation, but for the first time since Robert's death, I had a sense of purpose that made each day feel meaningful rather than endless. I spent hours at the library, researching international schools, updating my teaching credentials, and crafting application letters that showcased 35 years of educational experience. Each morning, I would dress carefully in my professional clothes, outfits I had worn to parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings when I still believed I was building a career that would last until I chose to retire. Now these same clothes felt like armor, reminding me that I was more than the discarded woman Laura had made me feel like. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a woman about my age who had watched me work at the same computer station for weeks. Eventually, she approached with the gentle curiosity of someone who recognized a fellow survivor of life's unexpected turns. "You seem to be working on something important," she said one afternoon as I was proofreading my teaching philosophy statement for the 5th time. "I'm applying to teach abroad," I told her, surprised by how confident I sounded saying it out loud. "International schools in Eastern Europe." Her eyes lit up with genuine interest. "How exciting! What made you decide to take such a big step?" I paused, considering how to answer. The real reason, that my own daughter had cast me out and I needed to rebuild my entire life, felt too raw to share with this kind stranger. But there was a deeper truth that felt safer to speak. "I realized I had more to give than I thought," I said finally. "And maybe the world is bigger than the small corner of it where I've been hiding." Mrs. Patterson smiled with the understanding of someone who had faced her own crossroads. "Sometimes the best adventures begin when we stop asking permission to live our lives." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to the hotel that evening. For months, I had been waiting for someone else to tell me what came next, hoping Laura would change her mind, hoping Danny would find a way to maintain our connection, hoping some external force would solve the problem of my displacement. But I was done waiting for permission to exist, done hoping for scraps of attention from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their consideration. The first acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered to the hotel's front desk with the formal weight of official correspondence. The envelope bore the insignia of St. Catherine's International Academy in Prague, and my hands trembled slightly as I opened it. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," the letter began in elegant script, "we are pleased to offer you the position of Senior English Literature Teacher at our academy. Your extensive experience and excellent recommendations make you an ideal candidate for our program." I read the letter 3 times before the reality sank in. They wanted me, not as a temporary substitute or a desperate last resort, but as their first choice for a position that would challenge and fulfill me. The salary they offered was modest but sufficient, and most importantly, they were providing furnished housing and assistance with visa arrangements. I was being handed a new life, complete with purpose, respect, and independence. That evening, I called Sarah to share the news. Her excitement was so genuine and infectious that I found myself laughing for the first time in months. Real laughter that came from joy rather than politeness. "Mrs. Morrison, this is incredible," she said. "Prague is beautiful. You're going to love it there. And think about all the students whose lives you're going to change." After we hung up, I sat in my hotel room and tried to imagine myself in a new classroom, surrounded by eager international students who saw education as an opportunity rather than an obligation. I pictured myself exploring cobblestone streets and historic architecture, learning a new language, discovering parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt excited about the future instead of just resigned to surviving it. The visa process took another month, during which I gradually began making preparations for the most dramatic change of my adult life. I sold the few pieces of furniture Robert and I had accumulated, keeping only what would fit in 2 suitcases and a small shipping box. I closed bank accounts, transferred my pension arrangements, and completed the endless paperwork that international relocation required. Each task felt like shedding an old skin, leaving behind the version of myself that had been defined by other people's needs and expectations. I also did something that felt both necessary and terrifying. I wrote a letter to Laura. Not an angry letter, though I certainly had enough anger to fuel one. Not a pleading letter, begging for reconciliation and forgiveness. Instead, I wrote the kind of letter a teacher might write to a student who had disappointed her, but still had potential for growth. "Dear Laura," I began, "I want you to know that I'm leaving the country to teach at an international school in Prague. I'll be gone for at least 2 years, possibly longer if the position works out as well as I hope it will. I'm not writing to ask for anything from you. Our last conversation made your feelings quite clear, and I've accepted that you believe you're better off without me in your life. I'm writing simply to let you know that I've found a new purpose and a place where my experience and knowledge are valued. I hope you and your family are well. Please give Danny my love if you think it's appropriate. I'll always treasure the years when I was able to be part of his growing up, and I hope he remembers that he has a grandmother who believes in his potential and wishes him every happiness. I'm not angry anymore, Laura. I'm grateful. Your rejection forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I still possessed, and to pursue opportunities I would never have considered if I had remained comfortable in the life I thought I wanted. Thank you for that gift, even though I know you didn't intend it as one. I wish you well. Mom." I mailed the letter 2 weeks before my departure, not because I expected or wanted a response, but because writing it felt like completing something that had been left unfinished. I was choosing how to end this chapter of my story instead of letting it peter out in bitterness and silence. The response came sooner than I had expected, arriving just 3 days before my scheduled flight to Prague. Laura's handwriting was familiar on the envelope, though I noticed her hands must have been shaking when she wrote my name because the letters were less precise than usual. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. "Mom, I had no idea you were planning something like this. I'm surprised you didn't discuss it with us first. Danny is upset that you're leaving without saying goodbye. Maybe we should talk before you make such a dramatic decision. Call me, Laura." I read the note several times, struck by how completely she had missed the point of my letter. Even now, facing my departure for a new continent, she was focused on her own surprise and inconvenience, rather than any recognition of what had led to this moment. She wanted to discuss my decision as if her input was required for my life choices, as if the woman she had shoved and discarded still needed her approval to move forward. But what struck me most was the absence of any acknowledgement of what had happened between us, any recognition that her actions had consequences, any hint of apology or regret for the cruelty she had shown. She wrote as if my departure was an impulsive overreaction to minor family tensions rather than a necessary response to complete rejection. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box of items I was shipping to Prague, not as a treasure to cherish, but as a reminder of the person I had been before I learned to value myself independently of other people's recognition. I didn't call her back. The night before my departure, I treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant. Not because I was celebrating, but because Elena Morrison, international educator, deserved better than hotel room microwaved meals. I ordered wine with dinner and toasted myself quietly, raising my glass to the woman who had survived being discarded and had chosen to see it as liberation. The next morning, as I loaded my suitcases into the taxi that would take me to the airport, I felt a profound sense of completion. The old Elena, the one who measured her worth by other people's approval, who accepted crumbs of affection from people who should have offered whole meals, was being left behind with everything else that no longer served me. I was about to discover what Elena Morrison could become when she belonged fully to herself and to work that valued her experience and wisdom. As the taxi pulled away from the hotel where I had spent the lowest months of my life, I looked back once at the building that had sheltered me during my transformation from victim to victor. But I wasn't looking back with sadness anymore. I was looking back with gratitude for everything that had brought me to this moment of absolute freedom. Prague welcomed me like a long-lost friend returning home after years of wandering. The city's golden spires and cobblestone streets seemed to whisper that I had made the right choice, that sometimes the most terrifying decisions lead to the most beautiful destinations. St. Catherine's International Academy was everything the letters had promised, and more. Located in a beautifully renovated 19th-century building near the city center, it hummed with the energy of students from dozens of countries all hungry for knowledge and opportunity. My colleagues, experienced educators from around the world, welcomed me with the kind of professional respect I had almost forgotten existed. "Elena," said Dr. Margaret Henley, the school's director, as she showed me to my classroom on the first day, "we've been looking forward to having someone with your experience join our English department. Your reputation preceded you. We received glowing recommendations from every reference you provided." My classroom windows overlooked a small courtyard where students gathered between classes, their conversations a delightful mixture of languages and accents. These young people had traveled thousands of miles to receive an education, and they approached learning with the reverence of people who understood its transformative power. The housing the school provided was a small but charming apartment, just a 10-minute walk from campus. It had high ceilings, tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light, and enough space for me to create a home that reflected my own tastes rather than accommodating everyone else's needs. For the first time in my adult life, I decorated according to my own preferences. Bookshelves filled with literature I wanted to read, artwork I found beautiful, furniture chosen for comfort rather than durability or family friendliness. Every decision, from the color of the curtains to the arrangement of the furniture, was mine alone to make. My students were a revelation. They came from diplomatic families, international business backgrounds, and expatriate communities, but what united them was their appreciation for education and their respect for the teachers who guided their learning. When I explained complex literary concepts, they leaned forward with attention rather than slouching with boredom. When I assigned challenging essays, they approached them as opportunities rather than burdens. Mrs. Morrison, one of my students, a 17-year-old named Alexandru from Romania, said after class one day, "Your classes are different from other English teachers I've had. You make literature feel alive, like the characters are real people we might meet on the street." These were the moments that reminded me why I had chosen teaching as my life's work. Not the administrative burdens or the standardized testing pressures that had complicated my later years in American public education, but the pure joy of watching young minds engage with ideas and discover their own capacity for critical thinking and creative expression. 6 months into my time in Prague, something unexpected happened that would change everything again, but this time in ways I could never have anticipated. The International Education Summit was being held in Vienna, and Dr. Henley had asked me to present on innovative approaches to teaching literature to multilingual students. It was an honor I would have declined a year earlier, when I still thought of myself as just a small-town teacher with nothing special to offer the wider world. But the woman I had become understood that expertise earned over decades had value that transcended geographical boundaries. My presentation focused on creating emotional connections between students and classic literature by drawing parallels between timeless human experiences and contemporary global challenges. I shared specific techniques I had developed over 35 years of teaching, methods that helped students see Shakespeare and Dickens and Steinbeck as writers who understood the same hopes and fears that drove their own lives. The response from the audience of international educators was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, teachers from schools around the world asked for detailed explanations of my methods. Several asked for my contact information so they could implement similar approaches in their own classrooms. But the most significant moment came after my presentation had ended, and most of the audience had moved on to other sessions. A well-dressed woman in her 50s approached me with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting things done. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Catherine Walsh from the BBC World Service. I produce a program called Global Classroom that features innovative educators from around the world. Your presentation was extraordinary, exactly the kind of story our listeners need to hear." She explained that her program showcased teachers who were making a difference in international education, focusing particularly on educators who had found new purpose later in their careers. "Your journey from small-town American teacher to international education innovator is exactly the kind of story that inspires people," she said. 3 weeks later, I found myself in a BBC studio in London, being interviewed about my teaching philosophy and my unexpected journey to Prague. Catherine Walsh was a skilled interviewer who helped me articulate ideas I had been developing over decades of classroom experience. "Elena," she said during a particularly thoughtful moment in the interview, "you mentioned that this international teaching opportunity came at a difficult time in your personal life. Can you talk about how professional reinvention can help people navigate personal challenges?" I paused, thinking about how to answer honestly without dwelling on the painful details of my family situation. "Sometimes life forces us to discover strengths we didn't know we possessed," I said finally. "When the identity you've built for yourself no longer fits, you have two choices. You can grieve for what you've lost, or you can explore what you might become." I chose exploration. The interview aired on a Thursday evening in October, reaching BBC World Service listeners in over 200 countries. I didn't think much about its potential impact. It was simply another opportunity to discuss the work I loved with people who might find it useful. But the world apparently was listening more carefully than I had realized. The first indication that something significant had happened came from Sarah Chen, my former student who was now a journalist. She called me the day after the broadcast, her voice full of excitement and pride. "Mrs. Morrison, I heard your BBC interview. It was incredible. You sounded so confident and accomplished. I was practically crying with happiness listening to you talk about your work in Prague." Over the next few days, messages began arriving from unexpected sources. Former students who had heard the broadcast and tracked down my email address through the school's website. Teacher friends from my years in American education who wanted to congratulate me on my international success. Even Dr. Henley mentioned that several prominent international schools had inquired about possibly recruiting me after hearing the interview. But the message that mattered most came exactly 1 week after the broadcast. It was from Danny. "Grandma Elena," he had written, using the email account he had set up for school projects. "I heard your interview on the BBC. Mom was listening to it in the kitchen, and she got really quiet when she realized it was you. I'm so proud of you for becoming famous for teaching. Can you tell me about Prague? I want to know everything about your new life." The email was long and filled with questions about my students, my apartment, the city where I was living. But it was also filled with something I had given up hoping for: genuine interest in my life, pride in my accomplishments, and the kind of love that had never really disappeared despite the circumstances that had separated us. I wrote back immediately, telling him about the castle I could see from my classroom window, the Christmas markets where I had learned to say "thank you" in Czech, the brilliant students who challenged me to become a better teacher every day. I told him about the woman I had become when I stopped waiting for other people to tell me who I was allowed to be. But I also did something I wouldn't have done 6 months earlier. I told him the truth. "Danny," I wrote, "I want you to know that leaving America was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the best. Sometimes the people we love most aren't able to see our value, and we have to find places where our gifts are recognized and appreciated. I hope you never have to learn this lesson the way I did. But if you do, remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it." His response came the next day. "I always knew you were amazing, Grandma. I'm sorry about what happened with Mom. I don't understand it, but I know it wasn't fair. I miss you every day. That evening, as I sat in my Prague apartment grading papers while Mozart played softly in the background, I realized that justice had been served in the most unexpected way possible. Not through confrontation or revenge or dramatic scenes of recognition, but through the simple act of living well, of choosing growth over bitterness, of allowing my true capabilities to shine in places where they were valued. The daughter who had discarded me as worthless had been forced to hear the world celebrate my accomplishments. The woman she had shoved and dismissed had been interviewed by the BBC as an educational innovator. The mother she had declared irrelevant had become an internationally recognized expert in her field. But the most satisfying justice of all was the internal transformation that had occurred. I was no longer measuring my worth by other people's recognition or living in fear of abandonment. I had discovered that Elena Morrison, when allowed to flourish, was more capable and valuable than I had ever dared to believe. The world had listened to my story and found it inspiring. My grandson had reached across an ocean to reconnect with the grandmother he had never stopped loving, and I had learned that sometimes the most devastating rejections are actually invitations to discover who we truly are when we stop trying to be who others need us to be. This was justice, not cruel or vengeful, but complete and deeply satisfying in its unexpected perfection. The letter arrived on a snowy morning in December, almost 18 months after I had left America, and 6 weeks after the BBC interview had aired around the world. I recognized Laura's handwriting immediately, though the envelope bore a more formal quality than her previous note. Thicker paper, carefully addressed, the kind of presentation that suggested this correspondence had required multiple drafts. I almost threw it away without opening it, not out of anger anymore, but because I had moved so far beyond needing her validation that reading her words felt like voluntarily stepping backward into a story I had already finished writing. The woman who had once desperately wanted her daughter's approval had been replaced by someone who understood that true peace comes from internal recognition rather than external acknowledgement. But curiosity won, and I opened the envelope while my morning coffee grew cold beside me. "Dear Mom," the letter began, and I noticed she was using that word again. Mom. After months of avoiding any acknowledgement of our relationship, I've been trying to write this letter for weeks, and I keep starting over because I can't find the right words. I heard your BBC interview, and I've been thinking about everything that happened between us. I realize now that I made some terrible mistakes. When Dad died and you came to stay with us, I was overwhelmed by grief too, but I handled it badly. I was angry at the world, angry at losing him, angry that life had become so complicated and difficult. Instead of supporting each other through our loss, I somehow made you the target of all my frustration. I convinced myself that you were becoming dependent on us, that you were giving up on your own life instead of rebuilding it. I told myself I was helping you by forcing you to be independent. But listening to you on the radio, hearing you talk about your work and your new life with such passion and confidence, I realized how wrong I was about everything. You didn't need me to push you toward independence. You needed time to heal, and you needed your family to love you through the worst period of your life. Instead, I abandoned you when you needed me most, and I've been trying to justify that abandonment ever since. Danny has been asking about you constantly since the interview aired. He's so proud of you, Mom. He talks about his grandmother who teaches in Prague and was on the BBC like you're a celebrity. He doesn't understand why we let you leave, and honestly, neither do I anymore. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you after what I did. I know you've built a new life that probably doesn't have room for the daughter who treated you so cruelly. But if there's any possibility of rebuilding our relationship, of somehow earning back a place in your life, I want to try. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so deeply sorry for everything, for the words I said, for the way I pushed you away, for making the worst time of your life even more painful and lonely. You deserved better from me, and I failed you completely. If you're willing to talk, I'd like to call you. Danny would love to talk to you too. We both miss you more than I can express, and we both realize now what we lost when we let you go. I love you, and I hope someday you might be able to forgive me. Laura. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and walked to my window overlooking the Prague cityscape. Snow was falling gently on the medieval rooftops, and early morning light was painting everything in shades of gold and silver. Students were making their way to school, bundled in winter coats, their breath visible in the cold air as they chatted and laughed with the easy joy of young people whose biggest concerns were exams and social plans. My life here was full in ways I had never expected it could be. I had work that challenged and fulfilled me, colleagues who respected my expertise, students who valued my guidance. I had learned to navigate a foreign city with confidence, had picked up enough check to handle daily interactions, had even developed friendships with other expatriate teachers who understood the unique adventure of rebuilding one's life in a new country. Most importantly, I had discovered that Elena Morrison was more resilient, more capable, and more valuable than anyone, including herself, had ever realized. Laura's apology was everything I had once hoped to hear. It acknowledged her mistakes, took responsibility for the pain she had caused, and expressed genuine remorse for her actions. It was the kind of letter that, 18 months ago, would have sent me running to the airport to rebuild the bridge she had burned. But I was no longer the woman who needed that acknowledgement to feel whole. I wrote back that same evening, but my response was very different from what the old Elena would have written. Dear Laura, thank you for your letter and for your apology. It took courage to write those words, and I respect you for taking responsibility for what happened between us. I want you to know that I've forgiven you, not because you asked for it, but because carrying anger was preventing me from fully embracing the new life I've built. Forgiveness was something I gave myself, not something I was withholding from you. Your apology helps me understand that your actions came from grief and fear rather than malice, and that knowledge brings me peace. But I also need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the relationship we had before, because the woman you hurt no longer exists. I've discovered that I'm capable of much more than I ever imagined when I was defining myself primarily through my relationships with others. I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how well I serve other people's needs, but by how fully I develop and use the gifts I was given. The life I've built in Prague isn't a consolation prize or a temporary escape. It's the life I was meant to live, the person I was meant to become. I'm not interested in going backward to reclaim a role that required me to diminish myself. However, I would very much like to rebuild a relationship with you and Danny that acknowledges who I am now rather than who I used to be. I'd like to be Elena Morrison, international educator and respected colleague, who happens to also be your mother and Danny's grandmother. Not Elena Morrison, the displaced widow who needed to be managed and accommodated. If you're interested in knowing this version of me, the woman who gives presentations to international audiences, who has learned to order coffee in 3 languages, who has students from around the world, then I'd be happy to talk with you. But I won't be coming back to America to resume the life I was living before Robert died. That life belonged to a different person, and she deserves to rest in peace alongside the husband she loved. I hope you can understand and respect that boundary. If you can, then I'd very much like to schedule a video call where you and Danny can see my apartment and hear about my students and maybe begin to know the woman I've become. I love you both, but I love myself now too. That's not something I'm willing to compromise anymore. With hope for a new kind of relationship, Mom. 2 days later, my computer chimed with an incoming video call request. Laura's face appeared on my screen, and I was surprised to see that she had been crying. Not the angry tears of someone who hadn't gotten her way, but the soft, sad tears of someone processing genuine loss and regret. Mom, she said softly, you look radiant. I can see Prague behind you and you look so at home there. I am at home here, I said gently. This is where I belong now. Danny appeared beside her on the screen, taller than I remembered, and with the slightly awkward excitement of a teenager trying to contain his enthusiasm. Grandma Elena, can you show me your apartment? Can you tell me about your students? I want to hear everything. We talked for over an hour. I gave them a virtual tour of my home, introduced them to my cat, a stray I had adopted who had needed rescuing as much as I had, and showed them photos of my students and colleagues. I told them about the medieval architecture, the Christmas markets, the poetry readings I had started attending to improve my Czech. Most importantly, I showed them the woman I had become when I stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Laura listened with the attention of someone seeing her mother clearly for the first time in years. "I had no idea," she said finally. "I never understood how much of yourself you had hidden from us, how much you were capable of when you had the freedom to pursue it." "I didn't understand it either," I admitted. "I thought being a good mother and wife meant making myself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. It took losing everything I thought I wanted to discover what I actually needed." We've continued those video calls, and Danny has even visited me in Prague during his spring break. He fell in love with the city, with the international atmosphere of my school, with seeing his grandmother as someone the world respected and valued. Laura and I are building something new, not the old relationship where I existed to serve her needs, but a mature friendship between two adults who respect each other's autonomy and choices. It's healthier than what we had before, even if it's less convenient for her. But the most beautiful justice isn't in Laura's apology or the rebuilding of our relationship. It's in what I discovered about myself when I was forced to start over. I learned that being discarded by the people you love most isn't a death sentence. It's a liberation. It's permission to stop trying to fit into spaces that were too small for your actual dimensions. I learned that worthiness isn't something other people bestow upon you. It's something you claim for yourself by living fully and authentically. I learned that endings can be beginnings if you're brave enough to see them that way. Most importantly, I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean going back to the way things were. Sometimes forgiveness means accepting what happened and choosing to build something entirely different from the pieces that remain. I'm 60 now, and I've never been happier. I have students who adore me, colleagues who respect me, work that fulfills me, and a grandsona who sees me as someone worthy of admiration rather than pity. I have a daughter who finally understands that the mother she tried to diminish was actually a remarkable woman who just needed the right circumstances to shine. And I have myself, fully, completely, unapologetically myself, for the first time in my adult life. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in the woman I used to be, please remember, you are worth more than other people's ability to recognize your value. You are capable of more than anyone, including yourself, has ever imagined. And it's never too late to discover who you're meant to be when you stop trying to be who others need you to be. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in gardens we never planned to plant, watered by tears we never meant to cry, in soil that was fertilized by the destruction of everything we thought we wanted. I learned that the silence that once hurt so much wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space for me to finally hear my own voice clearly. Space for me to grow into the person I was always meant to become. And that voice, once I learned to trust it, told me the most important truth I've ever known. Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the place that broke you. Sometimes the greatest act of love, for yourself and for others, is refusing to go back to being smaller than you really are. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for listening to Elena's story, and remember, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.